San Francisco, California, this is What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca with Andy Lipson and a special guest that we'll have today to discuss more about socialism from the different perspective. Bruce Neuberger. And so welcome, Bruce.
Thank you.
Yeah?
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and we've been promising this interview for a long time, and we keep putting it off. It's not your fault. You've been ready to go each time. So I'm excited about, this is actually our first interview that we've been able to do with sound with a guest here. So I'm excited about it. And I've known Bruce for, I feel like it's like maybe 8 years. Is that right? Something like that?
Something along that line.
Yeah. I've known him, both of us are close friends with a coworker of mine who's a friend of mine, and you've known her for maybe, I don't know.
A long time. I won't
okay.
say how long, because
Yeah.
that'll date me. So.
All right. But he's an activist, a socialist, and in many ways, one of the reasons for starting the show started out of discussions that I started with Bruce and another socialist about just what the heck's going on with socialism, with the world, and it's kind of led me to even wanting to do this YouTube channel. But I have found that Bruce is not just a committed activist, he's an honest activist. He lets me know what he agrees with, what he doesn't agree with, but I can actually talk with him. And one of the things that I do think the left needs to be able to do is talk about its where it agrees and its differences, and I feel like Bruce is a model for that sort of approach. Also, one of the few people from the 60s who stuck it out and didn't, in my mind, sell out, and has stayed a radical the whole time. One of the frustrating things for me coming up as a socialist was for people to say, oh, I've done that, I've been there, you'll get over it, you'll grow out of it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and that's not,
I still
Bruce
hear
didn't
that
grow out of it.
Just like we've grown out of all the problems capitalism solves.
Right. So
created.
I really appreciate you being here.
Oh.
I really respect you, and I just want to give you a forum for saying what your beliefs are. We're going to talk a lot about socialism and other stuff, but I was hoping first maybe you could just say a little bit just about your background, where you're from. You were a teacher at City College and stuff like that, so maybe just a little bit about that before we get into it.
Well, first I just want to thank both of you, Andy and Eduardo, for having this program and in carrying on these kinds of conversations. They're really important, and I appreciate the fact that you invited me to do this, and you're going to actually endure my talking. Where my background, I mean, I'm like Andy said, I came out of the 1960s. I was a high school student, graduated in '65, didn't know anything about politics, had no interest in it. But I came into, I sort of became of age, I guess you could say, after high school in a time of tremendous upheaval in the world, and it caught me like it did millions of others. And sort of shook me and forced me to awaken up to what was really going on in the world and look beyond the narrow limits of my life up to that point. And so I got involved with the anti-war movement. I happened to, by chance...
Vietnam War.
The Vietnam War, yeah. By chance, I ended up going in Berkeley in 1968, got involved in the movement there. I had been in the military in order to avoid Vietnam. That sounds contradictory, but I went into the reserves in order to avoid Vietnam. And after I got kicked out of the military, which is a story I'm not going to tell here, but once I got kicked out of the military, I wanted to work with soldiers, so I ended up going down to Fort Ord and helping others. Together we started a GI coffee house. It was at a time when, soldiers were rebelling in a big way. This is a story that really needs to be told. Actually, last night I went to an event, which is the 50th anniversary of the Presidio 27. The anti-war movement in the military is something that the powers that be certainly don't want to talk about. Yeah, it was very trying for them to see their military falling apart. I'll leave it at that at this point. Those of you who may not know a lot about that, I would encourage you to search out information about what happened then, because it's extremely important.
And we'll also put links. We can add links to things if you want to do
Yeah,
that.
I'm very
Right,
curious
okay,
to search more.
So actually the Presidio 27, whose anniversary was celebrated last night, was an important event, and that Presidio 27 was here in San Francisco, so I won't say more about that. But by chance, and so many things happen, and I think everybody's life, things happen by chance, but It just seems I just was running into people at that time that were, influenced me in many different ways. I ended up by chance working in the fields at that time, right after the anti-war project at Fort Ord, which at that time was a major military base on the West Coast. After that project, I ended up working in the fields for 10 years, and right at a time when the farm worker movement really was in its height.
The farm worker movement.
The farm worker movement, right? With the farm worker movement, people who are listening to this may be familiar with Delano and the strike in 1965 and the 5-year boycott of Cesar Chavez and so on. But in 1970, when the union won contracts in the grapes, they moved into the Salinas Valley, which was already actually quite ripe for unionization, and that's another longer story that is important to understand if you want to understand the history of California. But anyway, I ended up working in the fields then for 10 years at a moment when things were extremely hot in the fields. There was a tremendous amount of movement. Farm workers themselves were inspired by the 60s. They contributed to it. They were also influenced by it. The revolutionary movement that was sweeping the world, frankly, the whole world. So that was sort of my coming into politics. I crossed paths with people from an organization at that time was called the Revolutionary Union. People were influenced by revolutionary struggles going on in the rest of the world, which is something that people growing up in this era know nothing about. But in that era, there was tremendous revolutionary struggle going on. There were countries that had at least called themselves socialist at that time, the Soviet Union and China, which incorporated a vast part of humanity at that point. So it really felt at that time that revolution was sweeping the world, and that was the future, and it was going to be an imminent future, that capitalism was on the defensive. People really felt strong and felt confident that we could make a revolution. That was my generation. That's quite different from today, and that's one of the differences that characterizes what's going on today. Even though the problems that we were facing back then, which were enormous problems, racism, sexism, environmental destruction, not nearly on the scale that we see it today, and war, and other issues that brought people into political struggle. Today, those problems are far more severe. And so the reasons for people rebelling, as we did back then, are even greater today than in our day. But the conditions, the situation, the overall environment in this era is not nearly as conducive as it was back then. So it wasn't anything particular to my generation and being better or more moral or anything like that. It's just the circumstances in the world were different. And so it gave rise to greater sense of militancy, optimism, and confidence that we could actually change the world. And people gravitated towards revolutionary theory and revolutionary movements. And there was a tremendous outpouring then. And so literally hundreds, probably thousands of small groups of people getting together. We called them collectives in those days, getting together, reading works, revolutionary works by different revolutionary leaders, and particularly Marx and Lenin and Engels, and people studied Castro, and they studied all these different things that were going on in the world.
And Mao at the time as well, right?
And Mao.
Yeah.
The movement that I got involved in was more influenced by Mao and by the Chinese Revolution. And I'll talk about that a little bit when I talk about the socialism. And that has sort of been my orientation since then. That period of history, that revolutionary moment in time, has really sort of carried me throughout the years, so that a lot of people who maybe either got demoralized or never were inspired by revolutionary ideas missed that. And I feel very gratified that I was able to live through that period and live through a time when people were rising up, and live through a time when people were lifting their heads and looking to the possibility of a new kind of world. That was very inspiring, and I think that it also it tells you that sort of thing is possible. Okay, if you look around the world right now, it may not seem that way. There are so many negative things that are going on, but having lived through that moment, I can tell you that it is possible for people to lift their heads and to do great things as a mass of people to change the world. The changing the world is possible. It's not going to be. It's obviously not easy, but it is possible. And these revolutionary moments do actually give you a glimpse of what could be. And I did mention the GI movement. The U.S. military, the most powerful military in the world at that point, was literally on its knees, okay, because of the movement of the people, you know. And that particularly, I want to underline one point, and that is black people in this country, because it was the movement, the civil rights movement in the South, which was the spark that really started the whole conflagration of the 1960s, combined with the hatred for the war. Gave people a sense that not only was this society not just, but there were revolutionary elements in the society that could bring about a new society. Black people have, for 250 years, struggled against the most egregious forms of racism, violence, and repression, and we are so fortunate to have that kind of history in our country, especially in a moment when we face a very authoritarian, fascist kind of rule at this point, or at least a regime that would like to impose fascism here. That we have that history of struggle here is so important. And I would also underline the farm workers and immigrants. And I mean, there's so much to be said about that. The fact that we have millions of immigrants who are really carrying a lot of the weight of this whole economy on their shoulders. But also come from countries that have been engaged in struggle. And they bring that strength to this. We are so fortunate to have that. And these are the positive elements. The other point I would say was around women. In the 1960s, it was a great awakening among women. And the movement among women really did brought about, for example, the right to choose, abortion rights. It brought about a tremendous change over the 50s, the decade previous to that. And that liberation movement of women also woke up a lot of men to the issues of misogyny and sexism and so on. So those are really positive factors when we talk about potential for changing things. If it hadn't been for that, if it wasn't for those groups of people and the struggle that they've engaged in, and of course other people as well, the students back in the 60s and so on, if it hadn't been for that, we wouldn't be in a much worse situation than we are today. Not that we're in any kind of rosy situation right now, but we do have that history and we do have that legacy. Anyway, after I got out of the fields in 1980, I came to San Francisco. I became a cab driver. I drove cab for a number of years, and then at the latter couple of years that I was driving cab, I went back to school and I got a degree and I started teaching. So I taught for 30 years at an adult school and at City College. To immigrants. I taught ESL mainly, a few other things, but and that again was such a fortunate part of my life because I was able to meet people from all over the world and gain a deeper appreciation for different cultures and the importance of immigrants in this country, how much they've contributed for both to the culture and in so many different ways in this society. So. It's part of the backlash that we're seeing right now, that there's forces in this country that adhere to, believe in this mythology of white supremacy and that see the immigrants and the changing demographics here as a threat to that. It's based on ignorance, it's based on mythology, but it's a real thing because, and it's something that we need to be vigilant about and to oppose, right, with everything that we can to oppose it. So that's sort of my background. I got into socialism theory. I guess I did mention a little bit of that. It was a group called the Revolutionary Union, which was inspired by Mao and inspired by the Black Panther Party, principally, those two things. The Revolutionary Union eventually became the Revolutionary Communist Party. So I was very influenced by their politics and by the politics of Bob Avakian, who and continues to be a leader and a theoretician and so on. And I'll maybe mention a few things about that in my talk. But that was sort of my general orientation. Different people came into the movement with different directions or different influences. Okay, and people tend to bring into the movement those things that they're initiating reasons for becoming, or the things that inspired them. So that in part accounts for the fact that there are different trends, different ways of looking at it, different ways of examining the way society is. And one of the things I think that's really important that I've learned over the years is that we need to be willing and open to discussing these things in a frank way with people not only that we agree with, but people that we disagree with, because you might find out that some of your own ideas don't really accord with reality. And if you're not open to listening to other people's points of view, you'll never have the benefit of that information. And at the same time, you strengthen your own convictions in the course of trying to defend those views that you believe are true. So anyway, I've learned that. I can't say that I knew that all along, but I learned that along the way. And so yeah, that's it. Here we are in Trump country. Never really quite imagined that we would be here, but then again, the world is constantly changing. New things are constantly arising. So anyway.
And Eduardo, if you feel free, and we're going to ask different questions along the way.
Yeah, you had said something about more severe, and you said that it's more severe now. Do you think racism is severe? That's
really a good question, because on the one hand, coming out of the 1950s and Jim Crow, okay,
that's why I was.
Yeah, I mean the U.S. was racist up to its eyeballs, right? The genocide of the native people was not even hardly questioned at that point, right? The theft of the territory, which was at one point Mexico, which we're in right now, was hardly even known to people, let alone questioned. So a lot of things have come to the surface in that time, and the 60s helped to bring a lot of that. I mean, I can give you an example too, like the Japanese incarceration in World War II.
Yeah.
The elder population, you might say, of Japanese Americans didn't even talk about it with their children. It was the children who went through the 1960s and were inspired by the Civil Rights Movement and other movements, started going to their parents and saying, well, wait a minute, I read about how Japanese were all incarcerated. How come you didn't talk to me about that? So that encouraged their parents and grandparents at that point to open up about that, and that issue then became a topic of discussion, and the larger public then was able to be educated to some degree about that. So there was all that. No, the United States is steeped in racism and white supremacy, and the 60s was flushing that out. So there's been a lot of positive things in that, and there's also been the fact that the U.S. is much more now, today, dependent on, this is another issue, an evolutionary thing, that we're much more dependent on non-white labor, if you want to put it that way, and a much more demographically diverse society today than we were back then. Way more. Okay, and that's one of the things I think that frightens people. So it's a two-edged sword, because on the one hand, yes, these changes have been positive. They are very positive changes. The dismantling of Jim Crow, the bringing to light the horrors that this country has perpetrated on other people. Those are very, very positive things. But what we're seeing right now is a reaction to that, is a backlash, is a vicious effort to suppress all that truth, and to bring back into being something really that never existed. Make America great again. It's really, reassert the domination of white people in this country, and it is a lot based on mythology, because it's all the United States was built upon slave labor. It was built on the theft of the land from the native peoples and other peoples as well. So America was never really great in the sense that they're trying to say it, and so it's a mixed bag. I mean, I guess the chauvinists, the white racists, and so on, seeing these changes frightens them, right? It frightens the powers that be, that have really held this empire together on the basis of white supremacy and basically male chauvinism as well. Patriarchy and white supremacy. And those are being challenged. And on that basis, they are reacting and trying to viciously reassert this domination, this white domination. And anyway, yeah, I don't. Does that
Yes,
say
thank
something?
you.
Okay.
Andy?
Well, I'm going to maybe ask a question about the 60s and then about socialism.
Okay.
So for me, there seems like there are a lot of lessons to learn out of the 60s, but at the same time, there seems to be a break because many of the activists of the 60s haven't really stayed with it in the way that you have. If you could say one lesson from the 60s or what are the lessons from that period that you would want to carry over into this next round of struggles that we're going to need to take in order to challenge capitalism? What from that would you really want to, what lesson or what from that period would you want to have carried over into this generation right now? Even if it's not there, what would you want that to be?
See, I thought you promised that I was just going to have easy questions.
Next it'll be socialism, that's the easy part, yeah.
Right. Wow, what would we carry over? Well, I mean, one thing to carry over is that, what I said before, is that people are capable of changing, okay? You know, my own personal experience was replicated by hundreds of thousands and likely millions of people, that we grew up in an environment in which we didn't question what was going on. You know, I thought, you know, I grew up in Southern California, I thought this is the greatest country and the greatest state and all that sort of thing. And anyway, I accepted basically the way the society was presented by the mainstream media and, you know, even in the education system, to just accept the things the way they are, and this is the best possible world, and this is the only way things can really work, and all that sort of thing. But, you know, like I said, I graduated in 1965. By 1968, I already considered myself a revolutionary. I went from 0 to whatever, to, you know, 60 miles an hour. You know, in a relatively short period of time, but I wasn't unusual in that way at all. And the whole generation went that way. And so one lesson from that is that things can change very dramatically, very quickly in certain conditions. The other lesson is, I think, is really important. One thing that I learned years later, when I actually in a documentary about what happened in the Freedom Rides in 1962, what I didn't know, and this is 62, so this is pretty much still the 50s, okay? Jim Crow had not been dismantled yet. It was still very, very much the law of the land. Yet there were young people, black and white youths, who volunteered to go down to the South from all over the country and ride on these interstate buses in order to desegregate them, challenging Jim Crow, and thereby putting their lives at risk. These people, these folks back then, wrote their last will and testament before they went. And I didn't even realize it until many years later that they did that. And what had occurred to me was that, you know, and I came up, okay, a little bit later, 1966, 67, 68, whatever, around that time, not really knowing that history, but being the beneficiary of that history, the beneficiary of those struggles that they waged. And not only just waged struggle, but risked their lives. They put their lives on the line for a principle. So, you know, people are capable of great heroic actions, but two, those actions have a profound impact on the rest of us. So the sort of moral and philosophical base, or whatever you want to call it, of the 60s was laid by those tremendously heroic actions. And they filtered up. And if you go to Berkeley in 1964, where the free speech movement erupted, and then really started to spread this radical sentiment and rebellious spirit among white youths like myself, the originators of that free speech movement were people that had been in the South and knew that history, or had themselves been part of that history. They brought that morality, they brought that spirit, they brought that sense of human dignity to the movement, and we were the beneficiaries of it. So, you know, what you do, what individuals do, if you're a small number of people, what you do and how you comport yourself and the principles that you defend and stand for are really, really important, and can't be underestimated, even at times when you feel like you're in a very small minority and what you do doesn't seem like it's going to make a big impact. You never know what impact you're going to have. So those are a couple of the lessons that I would say. The other thing is what I would say also is that there are a lot of people fell away because from the struggle. In a certain sense, it's almost inevitable when you think about it. When there's a mass upsurge of people, okay, a revolutionary or rebellious upsurge of people, it's bringing in millions of people into motion, into political motion. When the environment that brought that about changes, then things settle back down and people are forced to make other decisions in their lives, like, well, how am I going to get a job, and am I going to complete a degree, and what am I going to do in my life? And other things intervene in family and so on, so that you don't really know what internally people think, even if they outwardly are not politically active. They may internally still hold some of those same beliefs. But if you see what I mean, by its very logic, upsurges are massive numbers of people, and periods of ebb are fewer people involved. I mean, that's just, it's kind of a breathing in, breathing out kind of thing. It's a part of a natural process in a sense. I guess the other thing that I would say is that seeing what's happened since the 60s and how the powers that be have reasserted their domination and what that has meant for humanity, what that has meant for so many different peoples around the world, from Central America to the Middle East, to Africa or what have you. What that has meant should inform us that next time when we do have an upsurge, when millions of people are in a mood of changing things and believe that it's essential and they want to be part of it, we really need to expend every effort we can to make that happen. Because if you don't, the old system will come back into effect, and it will impose the same horrific conditions that led to the upsurge in the first place. So now we're on the brink of, environmental catastrophe, and we were seeing that capitalism is pretty incapable of really confronting the crisis and doing what is needed to deal with it, right? We're seeing that. We're seeing endless wars. I mean, on and on and on. We're seeing the resurgence of white supremacy, like we were just talking about. We're seeing the resurgence of misogyny and patriarchy and all these things. So, I guess those would be some of the lessons that I would draw from the 1960s. So,
yeah, if I may, Bruce, socialism now.
Okay.
Yeah. So we had an episode some time ago. I had interviewed Andy about socialism, and in this area of socialism, as I have gotten to know more people who are actually activists and call themselves socialists, and they're different. It seems to be that they come from different traditions, and so we want to have a perspective that you can share with us, that will give the audience sort of another perspective, different from Andy's, but also in that same realm of socialism, that we can try to not repeat what some of the things that we had already discussed, because we're not interested in comparison, but we're more interested in your point of view about socialism in the tradition that you have followed since.
Okay, I'll try to do some of that. Thank you for that. All right, a couple of things that I would like to say in terms of, for people out there that are talking about socialism. Some of the, let's say, some of the elements that I think are important for people to have as part of their outlook on the world, to be a socialist. Okay, one is if you're not outraged about the way things are, if you're not angry about the way people are being mistreated, of the staggering inequality between different countries and between people within the countries and so on. If that doesn't bother you, if you're happy with the way things are, or you just think that there just needs to be some minor changes or whatever, if that's where you're coming from, you're not really going to be much of a socialist, okay? Because socialism really springs from the anger, the angst, the anguish, the concern for humanity and what's happening to humanity. It may start, for example, with you get mistreated, okay? Personally gets mistreated, or the group that you work with gets mistreated, or you come from, your religion, your race, your ethnicity, whatever. It may start there, that you start to feel a rebellious spirit against the system, but it can't stay there. It has to go beyond that. It has to go to a point where you're not only rebelling against your own oppression, but you're rebelling against a system that oppresses all people. Because socialism is about, socialism and communism, okay, is about liberating humanity, all of humanity. And we can't stop short of that. To stop short of that, it turns into its opposite. It becomes nationalism, or some form of, me, as long as I'm okay and my group's okay, well, screw the rest of you. It becomes its opposite, and we've seen that happen time and again in this world. So socialism really you have to have a sense of outrage. You also have to have a sense of broadness of mind, of wanting to free all of humanity from the scourge of a society that creates so much unnecessary misery. Okay, so those would be a couple of things I think are important. The other thing that socialists really need to strive for and need to understand is materialism. This world, we live in a material universe. Okay, everything that we know, everything that we can know, is in some way a matter in motion. It's some form of matter in motion. There is no spirit beyond our knowledge and capacity to know that somehow determines the way the world works. Okay, the world is knowable. The material world is complex. There's all kinds of complex processes that are going on, and there's endless need for study, and we'll never know everything by far. But on the other hand, the world is knowable. A lot of the world is knowable, and science can unlock that. This is, modern socialism arose on the basis of the flowering of science in this world. What Marx brought to socialism, which had existed prior to him, was a scientific spirit of really understanding the material world and the way it works, including society and how it's evolved.
And materialism?
Materialism. And not materialism in the crass sense of, I want a big car and stuff like that, right. Yeah. But materialism in the understanding that the world and the universe, everything is material, that it is matter in motion. It's in constant motion. It's constantly changing. Everything is constantly changing, which makes it very complex and difficult. But on the other hand, it also makes it somewhat understandable too, because and it opens up possibilities. So, there's never been a static society. There's never been a society that has had where there's been no change whatsoever for a prolonged period of time. Change is constant, and this society, although it would like to project itself as the end game for humanity, like this is the best we can do, and so don't think about anything else. This society is also subject to change and constant change, and the possibilities of new things arising. The other thing I would say in connection with that is that human beings are also very much, our behavior is very much determined, or at least influenced by the society that we live in, so that there is no one forever static human nature. Okay, a lot of the times we hear this thing, that capitalism corresponds to human nature. Well, capitalism sort of creates its own human nature in a sense. By the way it functions, it forces people to act in certain ways. A different kind of society would give rise to different kinds of human behavior. So on this whole question about whether humans are basically greedy or whether they're basically cooperative or violent and so on, all that is subject to the kind of society that we live in and influenced by the social order in which we act in, we grow up in, and so on and so on. So I think those are important points. The outrage is necessary if you're going to, really act in the way that needs to be acted on. The question is of being not looking at your own oppression as the be all and end all, but we need to free all of humanity. And the third thing here I'm talking about is what we call, dialectical materialism, which is that materialism is constant motion, and That includes society. Societies constantly have evolved, just like as a species we evolved. Human species, our societies have evolved, and are continuing to evolve, and continue to evolve. And that we can influence that. It's not determined by something outside of our our knowledge. There's not some grand plan out there by some being that we cannot really know anything about, except to guess about. That's not what's happening. Society, human beings came together. This is one of the great contributions, I think, of Marx, but and Engels particularly, that human society is really about producing the things that human beings need in order to continue surviving, which is shelter, food, clothing, and so on. People come together to do that in the course of producing. They develop relationships with each other in that course of doing that. Different societies produce things with different relationships, different levels of technology, different relationships, bring people together, and those relationships have a lot to do with the way we see the world. And those things are always changing. And anyway, so that's. Did you have another question?
If you can just differentiate for our audience about communism and socialism, because you had brought it up.
Okay. Okay. Let me get to that question by way of talking a little bit more about capitalism, if I could. Okay.
I was going to ask about capitalism, so
Okay.
good.
That was your question, Andy?
Yeah. So
Okay.
2 questions, 1 answer.
Okay. Well, okay. So in terms of capitalism, this is the way I understand it. Okay, there are 3 essential forms of motion under capitalism, or some people call them about 3 essential contradictions. However, whatever terminology you want to use. The first one, and this is something that is endemic to capitalism. It's not something that is imposed on it, or it's not something that it can do without or do it. It's part of it. It's a description of the way the system works. And the first one of these is socialized production and private appropriation. Okay, This is very, very important, and I think if you think about it, a lot of things will come to your mind. What does that mean? These big sounding words, socialized production, private appropriation. It means that the wealth of the world, the wealth that we all see around us, the buildings and the clothing and the cars and the transportation and the communication and the technology and the cities and everything that we see that has been changed by human hands one way or another, has been the product of a socialized process, a social process, meaning that many people have been engaged in that. The shirt that I'm wearing right now, I could not make this shirt myself, okay? Because in order to do that, I'd have to grow the cotton, I would have to harvest the cotton, I would have to process it, I would have to make the thread, I'd have to, all those various things, right? The buttons, made out of plastic or whatever they're made out of. I would have to do all that, and I wouldn't be able to. I don't have the technology. It would take me all of my waking hours just to make a shirt, okay? And so obviously,
Be naked a lot.
And I would be naked a lot. Yeah, you wouldn't want to see me in that state, I'm sure. But so we all take that. We take it for granted. But everything in this room, and the fact that we're looking right now at a cell phone is a product of generations of different technology, of workers and scientists and so on and so on. It's a social product. Okay, I think that's pretty obvious. Okay, so there's a tremendous wealth, and capitalism has made possible an enormous productivity, right? It's unleashed productivity by unleashing technology and so on, advancing technology. So it's even increased the socialization of production and made it a world global thing. But the appropriation of the wealth that's produced is private. It's controlled by a relatively small number of companies, corporations, people, and so on. So that incorporates a big problem, a big issue here. So because you've got all this wealth that's produced by all of us, human beings together, in this huge process, and yet it's controlled by a relatively small number of people. And they don't necessarily use that wealth in a way that benefits the larger community, right? In fact, they can't. And we'll get into that in a minute about why that is true. So you have this What a manifestation of this is the common expression, the rich get richer, the poor get poor, that some people control the wealth of the millions that produce. And they use that wealth to enrich themselves, but not principally for that. That's sort of a secondary factor. What do they use that wealth for is to reinvest that wealth to be able to produce more, because they're in competition with each other. And that competition drives them to constantly look for ways, shortcuts to producing their stuff cheaper and so on. I don't know if I need to go into that too much, but so this is a huge factor, okay? Capitalism cannot overcome that. It's endemic to its system. It's just part and parcel of capitalism. So we really, even under capitalism, even under the best circumstances, the wealth that's produced cannot really be used in a rational way to the benefit of all of the community that's participating in production, because capitalism doesn't function that way. It functions by private enterprises controlling it and then taking the proceeds of what is produced, the profit, and investing that in order to produce more. Okay, that's just the way capitalism is. If you describe capitalism differently, you're talking about a different system. Capitalism works that way. The second major important contradiction, problem under capitalism is what's called anarchy in organization. Anarchy in organization means basically this. If you go into a factory, you'll find that things are very well organized. And capitalists work hard at that to sorry about that.
Anarchy of your cell phone.
There you go. Capitalists work very hard at that because they need to make their production as efficient as possible, because, again, they're competing with others who are doing the same thing. I worked in the fields for 10 years, and I can tell you that agriculture, industrial agriculture in the United States is extremely well organized. Especially in places like Salinas, California, which has always been big blocks of land controlled by capitalists, whatever, growers, ranchers, and so on. And they produce a lot. It's amazing. I mean, I worked on a crew, for example. We would have a crew of like 35 people, okay, and we would produce enough. We would be able to harvest enough lettuce in one day to satisfy the needs of a small city. One crew.
Wow.
Okay. And that's because of how well the production was organized. Okay. But on the other hand, let's take a look at the other part of it. I also would go into fields frequently and see machines going through the fields disking under ripe lettuce that had never even been cut. Okay. Why was that? Because the market for that lettuce had fallen because there was too much lettuce on the market. The growers couldn't sell the lettuce for the cost of production. So in order not to continue to lose more money, they disked it under. And by disking it under, then they would cause the price to rise. So that is a tiny little illustration of the anarchy. On the one hand, you've got this very well organized machine of production. On the other hand, once you produced your product and you bring it to market, and Mark's talked a lot about this, there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to sell it. Okay, you're kind of at the mercy of factors that are beyond your control as a capitalist about how well you're going to do in that market. Of course, they try to manipulate things as much as they can and so on.
With monopolies and stuff like
monopolies and things like that, and get the government to But nevertheless, that anarchy is always under the surface. What does that anarchy produce? It doesn't just produce periodic crisis, which we've seen at different times in history, but it also produces things like war, okay, and conflicts. Why? Because, as a capitalist nation, you want to procure for your own capitalists, right, the best environment for them to prosper. How does that work? Well, I mean, if you need a certain, let's say, petroleum, right? If petroleum is an essential element in your productive system, you want to be able to capture, areas where there's cheap sources of petroleum. But you're not the only country that's thinking about that. Another country who's also capitalist and also has that same need, they're looking at it too. So, you had this phenomenon, especially as capitalism became more monopolized and became what we call now today imperialism. You had these different countries scouring the planet, looking for resources, trying to control markets, trying to control sources of labor, and so on and so on. And they came in conflict with each other. And we had two major, world wars that were really all about that. Okay, and then we've had wars ever since World War II that are essentially motivated by the same thing, although they haven't been world wars. They've been wars that have been kept to more regional issues for other factors that are more complex. But nevertheless, what has been driving that is this problem of anarchy and organization, controlling the market and attempts to control the environment in which you're trying to sell your product, so that your product will reach the market and you'll be able to realize a profit on it and then take that profit and reinvest it. And since all these different countries and all these different companies are all seeking the same thing, they come in collision with each other, and that creates disruptions, creates conflicts, creates cataclysmic problems. So there's many other ways in which this anarchy organization thing works. For example, let's just take the question of immigration. Okay, so I was talking about one of the aspects of anarchy organization is immigration. Okay, how is that? Well, for one thing, the U.S. is in competition with other countries, and so it's trying to sell its products as cheaply or cheaper than other countries do. And so one of the ways in which it attempts to do that is takes advantage of the fact that it shares a border with a country that it viciously exploits. And as a result of that vicious exploitation, forces people to flee that country to survive and come to this country. And then when they're in this country, then they deprive them of their legal rights, keeps them in a situation where it's difficult to defend themselves, and are forced to work in more egregious conditions and cheaper labor. That cheaper labor then it reinforces, or it benefits the economy and makes them more profitable and more competitive on a world scale. So that's another example where those impulses under capitalism to this anarchy of getting your products, in this case farm products, or among others, farm products, but not just farm products, many other products, also creates the conditions for exploitation of immigrants in this country, and also creates the immigrants, let's put it that way. Because when the United States goes to Mexico or goes to other countries and invests in those areas and pays very cheap wages, right? Wages that are not conducive for people to be able to make a decent living, and creates crisis in those countries, as we've seen in Mexico and in Central America. It also forces people out of their own countries, and because this country is the beneficiary of all that wealth, it can afford to pay higher wages. So you have that movement of people. That whole issue of immigration is very much related to this question of anarchy. The other issue of anarchy, I think that's worth mentioning here, is global warming. Okay, how so? Science is long time ago. This is a settled question that CO2 causes a warming of the environment. This is not complex science. Science that was well established, 30, 40 years ago, and yet because of the pressures of competition, the anarchic nature of the system, of constantly having to scramble to make sure that your company or your country's companies prosper in relation to others, the U.S. has basically taken its control of petroleum as one of its the factors that gives it advantages over other countries' economies and industries, and so it's become dependent on it. It's become dependent on coal and on particularly now petroleum, and regardless of the consequences of it. And of course, we know now, for example, that, and we probably could have guessed this already, that Exxon many decades ago knew that CO2 was leading to global warming and could lead to the crisis that we're seeing unfolding before us. And yet they hid that information. Not only did they hide that information, but they also paid people to deny it. They put stuff out there in the media to undermine science, so that people would at least have doubts about the science of global warming. So this again, the anarchy of the system prevents it from actually acting rationally as human beings. I mean, they're actually creating the conditions that could end, human life as we know it on this planet, which would obviously end Exxon as a company, and affect their families and so on. But can they do anything about it, really? They don't seem to be capable of doing it because of the pressures of the system itself and the way it functions. This constant conflict between different capitals and the struggle to survive, and again, this anarchy. And at the same time, they're becoming more and more efficient at pulling the stuff out of the ground. That's the organization part of it. Their science and their manufacturing and their ability to dig deep into the ground, pump oil out from ocean, deep into the ocean, all that stuff. That increases. That's the organization part of it. But the anarchy part of it, bringing that oil out and selling it and making profit and trying to outcompete the others who are trying to do the same thing, that is constantly pushing them to go into deeper waters and to more dangerous places and so on. It's not just like greed, but it is the way their system functions. And one of the things that was very striking recently here in San Francisco, when they had the climate summit, and you had people like Jerry Brown and Bloomberg and so on, who are very aware, by the way, of of science. They know the science. They know the consequences of what's going on. And yet, Jerry Brown, during his governorship, he approved 20,000 new oil wells. Okay, he has to know what the consequences of that are. Was he able to do anything about that? Well, I mean, in his own words, he said he couldn't. Okay, why? Because the way the system works, to have tried to stifle the production of petroleum would have had a very negative impact on the economy, on the capitalist economy, and it was not something that he felt he could do. And he may be right, the way the system works. So I mean, these are examples of that, of why capitalism can't resolve some of the more pressing problems that we're facing. The third form of motion, we've talked about the socialized production and private appropriation. Mm-hmm. We've talked about the anarchy and organization, just barely touched the surface of those two. The third form of motion is the one that more people are familiar with, who are around socialism or human history and so on, and that's class struggle, right? There's a struggle between different groups of people in relation to the actual production of goods. So that there are some people that are the owners and managers or whatever, and there are the others who are the are the workers, the ones that do the actual hands-on production, or whether it's working in a factory, whether it's working in a restaurant or whatever. So there is this split between human beings along class lines, not just having different jobs to do, but there's actually different social classes, and those classes come into conflict. Most commonly, we see that with a strike. We have a hotel strike going on right now.
In the Marriott. In
the Marriotts, mm-hmm. Right? I mean, if you go downtown, you can hear the drumming almost all over the city. It's amazing. Mm. I've never actually experienced that before. There's drumming going on everywhere around the city.
And there's solidarity around several cities.
And the solidarity around cities. So I mean, these are the workers in these hotels that are not making enough money to survive in this extremely expensive city, that are forced to to rebel against the owners of these hotels, mm-hmm. in order to extract a little bit more wages and benefits and stuff that they need for their families. So that's historically a very common phenomenon under capitalism. But the class struggle is not limited to that kind of struggle. Black Lives Matter, for example. Mm-hmm. We don't often associate it with that, but it's a form of class struggle. Why? Because in the United States, class and race are so intertwined you know, from the very beginning,
Would you use the word intersectional?
Intersectional, okay.
I'm just- Alright.
That's fine. From the very beginning of this country, you know, the intersection between class and race has been a very, very central factor to the development of capitalism here. And so the oppression of black people, obviously in the period of slavery, but even outside the slave areas, the whole economy was totally dependent on, in terms of its development, on slavery. And what comes to my mind right now, if anybody's really interested in getting into this more deeply, and I think it's an extremely important thing to understand for anyone who wants to change this country and wants to understand where we are at, is there's a book called The Half Has Never Been Told. That book really gets into how deeply dependent on slavery this whole capitalist system in the United States was, and how it got its jump start through slavery. So, so the class struggle also incorporates the fact that black people have always been kept as a subjugated people, okay, as a more exploited section of the working class, and a more exploited people, more oppressed people. The same thing goes for Latinos in general. The struggle of immigrants, right, for their rights is a part of this class struggle we're talking about here, because they're struggling for the rights as human beings, to be recognized, to have the same rights as other people do in the society, and then they kind of have a dual oppression. They're oppressed as non-white people, as minorities, or so-called minorities. And at the same, and they're also exploited as workers. So there's a dual. This is one of the things that struck me very strongly when I was working in the fields. You know, people looked to the farm worker movement back in the day, and had a lot of admiration for it, and looked at farm workers as really strong. And that's true. They were.
Were the UFW?
The UFW period, and that whole struggle. But one of the factors that gave that movement so much power was the fact that workers were not only exploited as workers in the field, they were also oppressed as Mexican or other minorities in the fields. You know, they had that dual oppression, and that created a kind of militant, rebellious spirit that erupted in the fields in the 1960s and 70s. So anyway, the class struggle. What I'm trying to say here is that the class struggle is not just what happens in the factory or what happens in the workplace, but it's much more generalized throughout society, and is expressed in many different ways. And in this country, because of our history of racism and white supremacy, and because the system is so much rested on that kind of racist oppression, racial oppression, that's part and parcel of the class struggle. So all these three major problems under capitalism are irresolvable under capitalism, which brings me to the next point. And you asked about the question of social democracy versus socialism.
Or socialism and communism as well.
And socialism, communism as well. Yeah, okay, good. I will get to that. Okay, well, let's just start with social democracy versus socialism, because right now a lot of people are influenced by things like Bernie Sanders, by Ocasio-Cortez, okay, and others who have express what we would embrace the social democratic, and basically to put it very basically, social democracy is a reform of capitalism. Okay, I'm not saying that what they're fighting for doesn't have some benefit for people. Socialized medicine, free education, lowering the cost of housing for people. Whether or not that's actually possible to do is a question. But the fact that they are putting that forward and fighting for that, I'm not opposing that in any way. What I will say is, though, that what they're doing is they're trying to carry out maybe a radical reform, but nevertheless reform of the system. It doesn't get to those three basic problems that I was just talking about. It doesn't really deal with the fact that there's socialized production and private appropriation.
Even they're still working within capitalism.
They're still working within capitalism. And those three contradictions that I mentioned are the ones that keep things, problems, and intensify the problems that humans are facing. So while some of those issues that they're raising are are admirable in a certain sense, or and I think they are sincere. They want to see improve people's lives. They can't get at the real problems of capitalism that are causing the horrors that we see all the time, whether it's global warming or the constant wars or homelessness and these other issues, and the exploitation and the white supremacy. It can't uproot it because it's not really going to the heart of the problem that causes these things in the first place. So I don't want to sound like I'm waging a war and these are all bad people saying this stuff. No, but it is important to recognize that there is a very radical difference between social democracy and socialism. Now, socialism and communism. Socialism is a transition from capitalism to communism. That's what marks it as a completely different solution to the problem than social democracy. Social democracy does not pretend to aspire to communism, which means an end to all these various problems and contradictions in capitalism. It doesn't aspire to it. It doesn't even raise it. It doesn't bring it up as a problem. It's just attempting to soften or smooth out some of the more egregious problems in capitalism. Social democracy. Socialism is to uproot capitalism completely and transform the world and transform social relations in a way that would get at these three major problems, right? For example, to resolve this contradiction between socialized production and private appropriation, you actually have to take the control of the means of production, and therefore the control of the profits and the profits made from socialized production. You actually have to take it out of the hands of these private corporations, private entities, and put it in the hands of a social entity. Okay, a social entity would be a socialist society, a government that brings into the decision-making process the people in as wide a scale as possible, okay, and has that goal, right? Socialism is a transition between capitalism and communism. It's very important to understand that socialism itself is a transition and not an end in itself. Okay. Socialism.
Communism is the end.
Communism is it's the end and the beginning. It's the end of an era of class divisions among people. But it's the beginning of a whole new process, which is going to be contentious in its own way.
But the end result, would you say, from being transitioned from socialism?
Well, yeah. Once the whole world has sort of overcome what Marx called bourgeois right, the right of some people to have privileges over others for a lot of different reasons. When people have come to the point where they see themselves as a part of a community that's working together to produce and try to resolve problems together, and not as one group, as one class oppressing another or benefiting for the labor of others. Once we get to that stage, it's a whole different behavior, but it's a whole different consciousness as well, right? And so Marx talked about, in the course of this transition from capitalism to communism, which is socialism, there's 4 fundamental tasks that have to be accomplished. Okay, the first one is to end the class divisions. okay, between capitalists and workers, and all the other aspects of that are involved in that class struggle contradiction. That's number one. Number two, to end all the production relations that rest on those class divisions. Production relations, in other words, you're no longer going to have this kind of management up here and the worker down here in the factory. You're going to have to figure out and develop new relationships where that form of relationship no longer is functioning. In other words, workers have to become much more themselves the masters of production, and not only just production, but society as a whole. And as a whole, the masses of people have to become much more the masters of their own destiny. Okay, that has to take place. So, socialized. So the production relations have to be transformed. Okay, the class struggle, the divisions among people along class lines, the production relations need to be transformed. The social relations that flow from those production relations. For example, when we talk about white supremacy and misogyny and all these sorts of things, although to a certain degree the question of women and men and patriarchy predates capitalism, and in some ways may even predate class society. But ultimately, what we're working for is a world where those kinds of inequalities and patriarchal relations are abolished, right? And that women are really liberated and become fully part of equal relationships and leadership on all levels. So all the social relations that flow from those production relations, okay? The fact that in this country, let's take a look at it. It's mainly white men that control the levers of production and control the mass of capital, right? And that has corresponding social relations that flow from that power that they have. That would have to be overcome, right? And it would transform our social relations as well. It would undermine the basis for white supremacy, for example. Not automatically. It would be a struggle. Okay, socialism is struggle. Socialism is not going to be some calm, nice thing where everybody's, lives happily ever after. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be very contentious. And the last point is that Marx talked about in the Four Alls is all the ideas that flow from those social relations. Okay? So we're talking about a period of transition where all the various contradictions under capitalism and all the distortions that it's created in the world and in society, we work to overcome them. Okay, you work to overcome them. And one way you're going to know whether or not that socialist society really is socialist or not is if it continues to move forward to ameliorate's the wrong word, but to overcome those various contradictions and divisions among the people. Okay, if you have a socialist society that says, okay, everything's fine, we can just let things be. We have managers and we have workers, and okay, but they're being paid more equal than before, and blah blah blah. If that's their attitude, it's not really socialism anymore. Actually, it's maybe a country, a system that calls itself socialist, but it's actually in reasserting its capitalism. Okay, because it's freezing the contradictions as they are, and allowing the inequality to continue, and things go in one direction or another. Let's put it that way. In society, things either people are moving in a direction of more democratic rights and more equality and more overcoming of divisions and so on, or it's going the other way. Things generally don't just remain in some form of equilibrium for very long. So this gets to the point of, okay, your goal is from socialism to go from capitalism to communism. It's a constant need for not always necessarily revolutions, but certainly movements and certainly discussion, and certainly sharp struggle, because it's going to be a sharp struggle. I mean, there's going to be people, and we've seen this in socialist societies, right? We've emerged in the Soviet Union and China. We've seen it where there are some people who may be revolutionaries during a revolutionary period, but then after the revolution, they kind of settle in to try to, carve out a little space for themselves, which is a little privileged bit of space, thinking, well, look, I sacrificed. I lost so and so in the struggle. This happened. For example, in China, I know a lot of different circumstances like that. Sorry about that. This is why it's really important to understand the socialist countries that have emerged and how they have gone about trying to deal with this transition. Okay, Lenin knew this. For example, Lenin knew that socialism was a transition, and he was working on that question. He was working on that problem within the context of the difficulties that the Soviet Union faced at that point in time. And Mao and the people around Mao knew that too, and they went about trying to deal with that and trying to push things forward to communism as well. We can sit back and look at how well did they do, or what kind of mistakes they made along the way, because inevitably they would make mistakes, and try to judge and try to learn from that. But I think it's important to recognize that actually that's what their consciousness was. This is what their goal was. And there were a lot of things that weren't understood when the first socialist country came into being, which was the Soviet Union in 1917. There were a lot of things about socialism that people didn't know, because it was the first time that it had ever happened that a country became socialist with a leadership that actually wanted to go to communism. So there were a lot of things that were mistakes were made, and I think one of the reasons I think that Mao actually represented a more advanced form of socialism was because the Chinese were able to learn from some of the experience of the Soviet Union and some of the mistakes that they saw them make, and tried to correct in their own process. And one of the things that they summed up was that once you get to socialism, you still have classes and class struggle. Okay, you don't just overcome that boom because once somebody else takes over the government's office. You know what I mean? And all the contradictions, all the problems and divisions among people disappear. It doesn't happen that way. You have to work at it. And you can't automatically in one fell swoop just say, okay, we're all equal now, everybody's going to get the same pay. It doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work that way. So, I mean, and you're operating within a world of hostile powers around you. You have certain necessities that you face as a country to defend yourself and maintain an economy, and it's a very complex process. And so I think it's right to sit back and try to judge and criticize things that were not done well. It's absolutely appropriate, not only appropriate, it's necessary to do that. But it's also necessary to take into account the problems that they were trying to grapple with at that time. And so, and just, I'll just say this, and I'm probably going to end pretty soon here, which is, I talked earlier about Bob Avakian and the Revolutionary Communist Party, that I think, in my opinion, okay, this is my opinion, I believe that Bob Avakian has done more study about socialism in Soviet Union and China and trying to learn the lessons, positive and negative, from that than anyone else that I know about. Okay, there may be others out there that have done it, but he's the one that's done it the most that I've known about, and I've learned a lot from the conclusions and the study that he's done. So that's one of the things I think is important. I mean, if people are interested in this subject, and I neglected to say this before when I talked about some of the important factors of a person becoming a socialist, when I mentioned things like being a materialist and also having
being discussed about
discussed by what's going on. The other thing is that people need to constantly be searching out and expanding their knowledge of things, delving into different areas, trying to learn as much as they can, engaging with ideas that they don't necessarily agree with, to see whether or not your ideas are right or not. So I would just encourage people, whether they agree with Avakian at this point or not, check out some of the stuff he's written and see what you think about it. You know what I mean? So I think that I want to end on this point about socialism, the fact that it's a transition from capitalism to communism, that in many respects we're still in our infancy as a human species in dealing with that problem of how to make a transition from not only capitalism, but we're talking about class society, because of course capitalism is not the only class society we've had in the world. We've had maybe 10,000 or more years of class society. To make that transition from a class society to ultimately getting to a classless society is a very difficult transition, and far more difficult than I think Marx or Engels realized when they were around. Okay,
well, they definitely thought it would be done by now.
I think they would have thought, what the hell's going wrong with you guys? I mean, get it together, man. But yeah, it's very complex. The other thing is, I mean, and there are a lot of different things that I've looked back on and realized that I was mistaken about in the past. One of them was, and I think this was fairly common among a lot of people who believed in socialism, was we kind of believed that it was an inevitability. You know, we had this kind of idea of like, well, you know, first humans go through this stage of hunters and gatherers. Is kind of like a primitive communist society where we share everything, and then we, you know, go into a stage of slavery, and then it's feudalism and capitalism, and then it goes into socialism, and then ultimately communism. Something like it was already foretold that this was going to happen. It's like a progression that's sort of a, you know, and that is making Marxism or socialism or whatever into a religion. It's the same kind of having faith in some kind of, what is it you have faith in? It's like this historical God that is determined, and that's a real mistake. It's a real mistake, and
people fall into this trap.
And yeah, it's kind of like a nice thing to think about, you know. Hey, well, you know, I may screw up in my work, but nevertheless, we're going to get there anyway, you know. But there is no guarantee that humanity is going to survive capitalism. Okay, and I think that's become more evident. Probably much more. The young people coming up right now are probably much clearer about that than I was when I was their age. But so we can't take anything for granted. And you know, again, the transition from capitalism, well, first of all, even to get to socialism is going to be a big task.
One thing I would say, I mean, we'll wrap up here, but I think some of the people who would call themselves social democrats, Bernie Sanders socialists, would say we can get to socialism, but would probably describe it as a more evolutionary kind of, like, we can take it step by step, a little safer in a sense, as opposed to the idea of an insurrection, revolution, mass strikes, general strikes.
All that stuff. Yeah.
Do you have what do you have a take on that, or what would you say about those two
Well,
things?
I mean, one, it is a nice thing to think that it could happen that way, and I think that you know, if it could happen that way, it would be beneficial to all of us, not have to go through this tremendous wrenching and potentially very violent transitions. But the reality is that if you're going to make that kind of a transition, the kind of we're talking about, to real socialism, and to you know, and you know, it's not going to come about by a gradual process exactly that way. I mean, there may be elements of gradual process, but there's going to be violent, or at least sudden and dramatic shifts that are going to have to take place, because, I mean, just for example, just to expropriate the capital, there's trillions and tens of trillions of dollars that is held in the hands of a relatively small group of people. without expropriating that huge amount of wealth, you're not going to be able to begin this process of transformation of society. There's just no way around it. It would be nice if you could. We could all vote that Exxon's going to give up its capital, and all these other corporations are going to give it up, and they're, that would be nice to think, but it's not going to happen that way. It can't. So, unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know.
I think it's fortunate, because
Okay.
I do also think that like you described in the 60s, that struggle is necessary for changing people.
Yeah, good
and
point.
we ourselves need to be transformed
Right.
in this process. So
Right.
I actually think, not that it's fortunate, it's the only way it can be.
Right.
We have a lot of change to make of ourselves organizationally,
Right.
and that's going to require an upheaval for all of us. We're going to be different people at the end of all this.
Oh yeah, that's very good. I agree with that, Andy, totally. And it's better to be open-eyed about this, wide-eyed, whatever you want to call it, and realize what you're up against than to delude yourself into thinking that it's going to be something else and then be rudely slapped in the face with reality.
And the fact that it's not going to happen inevitably, that there are very negative outcomes that can happen if we don't change course.
Very negative outcomes that could happen, even if we try to change course and we fail.
Yes.
There's no guarantee of success here.
That's right. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's really that's very important. I think that it's really hard to conceive of communism, to be truthful about it. It's one of those things because we have been so long in class society and capitalist society, and so used to divisions and so on that go on. I think it's hard to conceive of it, but Lenin once made a point about communism springs from every pore. I mean, and there's truth to that too. There's constantly, you constantly see people behaving in a way that reflects a desire for a more just social order, and I think our basic morality as human beings. There's a certain. I know Richard Dawkins talks about this stuff. He says morality is not determined by religion. It's actually he claims there's a certain morality within us. And I think that there's something to that, because I don't think as a species we would have survived all the hardships and the problems and the difficulties that we encountered, in the natural world and so on. We wouldn't have, if we hadn't had a very strong sense of cooperativeness among us as human beings, as a species. So there's that is one of the characteristics of humans, but that will make it possible for us to do that. But we're in a race against time, it would seem, with the plundering of the environment by capitalism at an ever greater pace. And who knows whether we're going to be able to outrace the destructiveness of the system. Yeah. So, I was.
That's a really great, uplifting note. I don't know, Eduardo. You want to ask another question, or just?
I just want to say one more thing,
Yeah,
though.
yeah.
I just want to say one thing about the millennials, okay? And I don't have a definitive answer about the millennials.
Right.
But
You're speaking about my generation.
your generation, okay. I mean, compared to my
This
generation.
question wasn't on here. I know that.
Compared to my generation,
Yeah.
we were babes in the woods compared to the millennials, in the sense that millennials have a much. I mean, what I've seen, okay, and I'll just take the Parkland example as just one example, right? That when that tragedy happened in Parkland High School in Florida, and the students there began to activate and mobilize and so on, when that rally that they conducted in D.C., that huge, gigantic rally they conducted in D.C. I just thought that the sort of on the basic level of human decency and respect for different voices, they showed a great deal of sophistication, if that's a good word for it, of open-mindedness, broad-mindedness, and I think that's extremely hopeful, because it really. A lot of the stumbling blocks that are from here to socialism and communism have to do with overcoming the fact that human beings settled in different parts of the world develop different languages and cultures and even different outward characteristics and stuff like that. And that in the course of capitalism and globalization that we've seen and so on, people are beginning to come into contact with each other much more. And there's been all these wrenching struggles that have happened in the course of that. The fact that people begin to realize, and not only just tolerant, but rejoicing at and embracing diversity, and fighting for it, and demanding that that's the way we should be, and opposing all the efforts to divide people along those racial and gender and sexual lines and so on. That is an important seed. Okay, it's an important seed. So, and it's a seed that really we didn't have, or we didn't have in the same way that this generation.
You're talking about in comparison to the 60s.
In comparison to the 60s, yeah. Okay.
Well, excellent. Thank you, Bruce.
Well, thank you. Thank you, guys.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay.
For this.
And I also think one of the things that in some future episode we actually will hope to get more into like actual differences, similarities
between two different perspectives
on socialism.
Oh,
We are both revolutionary socialists, but we have some differences that I hope that we can have an episode where we can sort of get at those and see that we don't actually end with a fist fight at the end. And that would be the goal.
Yeah,
We didn't
because I would lose.
But anything,
that's why I would avoid it.
But also to see that these are ideas people are going to have to figure out, or among some of those ideas, because I do believe the ideas for the revolution do matter. I think we both agree with that.
And let me just say, put an asterisk on that point, because maybe I painted too rosy a picture of the 60s. There was a lot of divisions that came out of the 60s. And a lot of what I would call sectarianism, which was very harmful. Sectarianism, I think, is basically throwing up a wall of resistance to somebody else's ideas, not necessarily on the basis of the merit of those ideas, but because those ideas are associated with what we would call a trend or an idea, without really examining them. And this is one of the reasons why sometimes I've argued with people. Let's not use labels. Let's just not use labels. Let's talk about actual ideas and how your ideas stack up to my ideas or whatever, and try to understand the differences that way, because sometimes when labels get thrown up, and look, I see people that I respect them, and they're lifelong activists and so on, but I hear them saying things about somebody that they had a conflict with 30 years ago, and it seems like that they can't seem to.
Amber,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that if you've had a conflict with somebody 30 years ago, you should invite them to dinner. Or you should invite them for coffee and find out where they are now and where you are now, okay? Because very likely you're not in the same place you were, and they aren't in the same place they were. And in any case, it would be interesting to hear how they've analyzed those 30 years. Anyway, that's one thing I would say. I hope that when a new period of struggle and movement, which is starting to happen already, emerges, we will not necessarily, I'm sure we're going to repeat some of the same problems, but that we won't, to the same degree, repeat problems that we've had before.
Of the sectarianism.
Of the sectarian and division. I mean, there's a need for principled struggle. I mean, I'm not saying that everybody should just, accept whatever anybody else says, even if it doesn't accord with their beliefs. But let's talk about different principled differences, not because you came out of one tradition or another. Therefore, everything that you say has got to be suspect. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I wanted to ask you, when you said in the fields, you were actually working in the fields.
Right.
Is that
Yes,
what
I was
you're
actually
referring
working
to?
in the fields.
Like gosh.
bent over.
Yeah.
Agachado, como dicen, ¿no?
Ajá, sí.
Como un burro.
And Bruce has written a book. We didn't talk about it here, actually.
Can you
called-
please tell us?
Yeah.
Okay, the name of the book is Lettuce Wars. Go out there and buy it right now.
I'm going to put a little thing up on the video. I will.
Anyway, Lettuce Wars, and I wrote it a few years ago, and it was based on the 10 years I worked in the fields. And I do want to say, just, that I wrote the book because there are a lot of books out there about the farm worker movement in the 1960s, 70s, but most of them concentrate on what happened in the union, within the ranks of the union leadership, and how the leadership reacted to the things that were going on in the world at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Not too many of them really talk much about what was going on in the fields among the workers, and I was there, I heard the conversations, I engaged with people, so those are the strongest recollections that I have, and I learned a lot from working among the workers, and I tried to reflect that in the book. It's like the 1960s people, when you talk about the 1960s, people think, well, they talk about the students, they talk about, the civil rights movement and Black Panthers and so on, all of which were important. But they don't really talk about the workers themselves in the fields were influenced by the 60s, and they had radical ideas too. They had their ideas about how the world should be and how it was that it was the way it was and so on. And there was constant discussion among people about all these different questions that everybody else was talking about, not in the same, using the same language. They weren't so much talking about Marx and Lenin and Engels and whatever, but Mao. But they were nevertheless talking about the same issues. Okay,
And your book addresses.
I talk about that. I try to reflect on what I the struggle that was going on around me and the way I picked up on it.
And then how the bureaucracy did influence and how workers responded to maneuvers from the top and things like that.
Right,
That's in the
right.
book as well.
There was very sharp conflict within the union too as well.
Which are going on today. Same kinds of things are going on today.
Right.
So please check that out, and we'll
Okay.
link to your book.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. Andy, anything else you want
Just
to
thanks,
say?
Bruce, for being part of
Thank
this.
you so much, Bruce.
And I hope folks have enjoyed this. What's the thing we say? If you like this,
if you like this, please share, subscribe, and rate and review.
Right.
Any of that would help us in the most trafficked places,
iTunes,
YouTube and iTunes.
And Stitcher is actually getting some traffic now too.
Oh, are
So
we?
it's good, yeah.
Okay, well, he gives the analysis of the, ¿cómo se dice? And the,
The
graph.
analytics and stuff
really?
like that.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So be sure to make comments and review us on iTunes.
Analytics.
And do we know what we're going to do next week? I don't think we do.
We will do something, maybe The Journalist. I have an idea.
Okay. All right. Eduardo's got an idea. So.
The journalist that has disappeared.
Oh, that's right. This
I'm
dude in
very-
Saudi Arabia. It's a big deal. Yeah.
I'm curious.
It's going to
of
mess the United States up too.
getting your point of view.
Yeah.
Is there any thought about doing anything around detention camps? Immigrant detention?
We tackled immigration, but we should possibly maybe
It's
consider
going to come
doing
back around again.
ICE
Something around
and
ICE. Yeah.
detention.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
That is a very good idea. Thank you, Bruce. You see, we can get input like this from our audience listeners.
Well, it's interesting that last night when I went to this 50th anniversary of this very significant event that took place here at the Presidio 27, that was the one topic that was most outside the realm of the anti-war movement, anti-Vietnam War movement. The one topic that came up over and over again among people who had been longtime activists and still continue to be activists now. They were talking about the children, particularly the children in these detention camps at the border and so on. So,
Which does remind me that people, if you are listeners, if you have ideas on things that you're like, oh, send us drop us a line, maybe. But there's lots of things to cover each week, and those are two right there. So,
well, thank you guys. I appreciate it.
all right.
All right.
So,
Rate, review, and subscribe.
all right. We'll see you next week.
All right.
Bye bye.
Bye. Adios.
Ciao.